Hey, howdy, hey, my brewing brothers and sisters.
Greetings, Cretans.
We're
Good to see you again.
back again. Apparently, you've got some sloshing beer in the background. I'm
Yeah,
sloshing a
yeah.
bit of beer myself.
The famous flying beer photo taken by a friend of mine.
And that's famous.
Pardon?
That's famous.
Yeah, locally in the
Locally famous.
in the greater Lancaster area.
The Greater Lancaster. Oh well, who took that? Is that like a push or?
No, that's mutual.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
there you
having
are.
audio issues.
I don't know. It seems like beer abuse or something.
No, it was a difficult setup. He had to glue the beers to a skateboard, run them down a ramp, and time flash and everything.
Stop it and get it to slosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know who's not an abuser, a beer abuser?
Hey, maybe perhaps our good friend John Blickman.
That's right. I mean, I've never seen him. I've seen him abuse a lot of things. I've seen him abuse himself and other people, but not beer. Not beer. He has a great deal of respect for beer and care for beer, which is probably why he puts all that effort into creating such great brewing equipment. Innovating your brew days, so to speak. Yeah. He also pays for the show, so you don't have to. So if you get a chance, check out blickmanengineering.com. You can even send an email to John Blickman at Blickman Engineering. Just send it to feedback@blickmanengineering.com. Tell him how much you love this show and that you appreciate that he has paid for this for the past 15 plus years that we've been doing it. So there you go. Or tell him how much you hate it and it's a waste of time and bits on the internet or whatever. Today, we have with us my friend and former employee at Heretic Brewing Company, Mr. Jonathan Hughes, PhD, UC Davis. He's going to speak with us about creating a quality control program on a budget. Hey, John, how are you doing today?
Hey, Jamil, I'm doing great.
You look good. You look like you're surviving the pandemic and enjoying life.
Doing great. Yeah.
So tell us, the reason I wanted you on the show is because you're teaching a class at UC Davis that's available online as well about creating a quality control program on a budget. What's that all about? How do you get started on that?
So this is just a little one-off kind of webinar. So I'm teaching for the Master Brewer Certificate program that's just wrapping up here next week, and then just this little one-off webinar. It's going to be what might be the start of a series called Brewing on a Budget. We're still sort of playing around with that title, but this is starting a QC lab on a shoestring. And I just sort of wanted to do this because it seemed like lab was something that was really scary for a lot of brewers.
Yep.
And I wanted to kind of demystify some of that and show you some of the hacks that I had to do when I was setting up a lab at Heretic that worked just as well as some of the really expensive scientific equipment out there that you can find.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you say webinar, a little webinar, but it's 3 hours, right?
Yeah, it's 3 hours long. So, and that's not going to be me yapping at you for 3 full hours. We'll take breaks and we might break out and do some discussions and stuff. But
well, you're getting your money's worth. I think it was $75 for 3 hours of. I think that's a deal. I don't think you're going to find that kind of information that cheap anywhere on the web. So I recommend people check that out. Now, what's the first steps though? If somebody wants to, let's say I've got a small brew pub and or just a small brewery, 5-barrel and a tasting room. How do I get started in quality assurance? I know of even larger breweries breweries our size, Heretic size, that don't have a lab.
Yeah, absolutely. The number one thing that I always tell people, and this is a quote from Adam Savage of Mythbusters fame, that the difference between screwing around and science is writing it down. And this is what I always used to joke with the brewers at Heretic with, is if they were writing something down on a clipboard, they were doing science.
Mhm.
And so number one thing is just write everything down, and then you can track your progress, make sure if you change something, see what the results of that change were.
I'm a huge believer in that. Without any sort of data, you have no idea what you're doing. You don't really know what your last batch was, or the batch 10 batches ago, what you did that made that taste good versus the one that you're doing today. You're just messing around. So yeah, I like that quote too. That's a great way to put it. So
Yeah.
what kind of, so that's cheap, that's easy, that's pencil and paper, or
Mm-hmm.
a Google Doc or whatever, so you can share it with others if you need. I think that's a great idea. So that's cheap, that's easy. What sort of things should people be writing down?
I mean, everything from recipe, if something changes, if you've changed your supplier for hops, yeast, malt, whatever. What the, track the progress of your fermentation, right? Take your gravities 2-3 times a week, take your pHs, write all of that down. And then if something goes wrong in a fermentation, you can sort of go back, compare that against previous batches and say, hey, look, the pH didn't really drop quite as quickly on this batch, so what happened? And then you can look at what you wrote down about your yeast pitching. And if you're counting yeast and measuring their viability, you can kind of track that on there as well. So yeah, just, I mean, everything that has to do with the progress of the fermentation of the beer.
Yeah, that's huge. I'm a big believer in that, because you can track, you could graph your pH and your gravity readings, and batch after batch after batch, on a beer, on a lot of beers will be very similar, and on a specific beer they should be exactly the same, or really close to the same. And if you see a beer start to swing differently than that path, you already know something's wrong. Before you get to the packaging stage, which is expensive, that you potentially have quite a problem. So okay. Yeah. I mean, that's, everybody should be able to take pH readings, gravity readings. And I know breweries that don't have the ability to take pH readings as well. Yeah. It's like, it's pretty cheap. It's less costly than a batch of beer. I think when a lot of people think, QA, QC, they're thinking, oh, it's lab stuff with chemicals and glassware and microscopes. What sort of things should people be doing there, or is there other things they should do that are easier than that or simpler than that?
Well, I think that sort of the next step, even before we get into any labware or anything like that, is just coming up with a good sensory program, and training yourself to be able to detect defects and differences in your beers. So being able to look at a beer and note the color, the clarity, being able to taste any differences in bitterness, being able to taste any of the off flavors. And I always advocate for these sensory training kits that you can buy, where they've got purified off flavor compounds that you can spike into beer, and then you can taste. You can get that hydrogen sulfide rotten egg flavor. You can get the acetaldehyde green apple flavor. And it's actually really fun. You can do this as a sort of team building exercise with your brewery. Get all your staff, not just back of the house, but get your front of the house people in there as well, and everyone get together and they can all talk about, oh my god, that butyric acid tasted like vomit, and it's kind of fun. It's a little bit of a bonding experience, but at the same time you're learning how to pick out those flavors, because I think one of the most important things about sensory is really just getting a vocabulary and being able to put words to those flavors. Because I mean, people taste beer and they say, yeah, it tastes like beer, but then when you say, yeah, but do you get that little bit of grapefruit on the hops? And then they say, oh yeah, I did get that grapefruit. And then from then on out, that little note is sort of stuck in their brain.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's another good point, is train up all your people in at least some of the basics, or make them aware of quality as it relates to the sensory aspects. Absolutely critical, and again, cheap. Those sensory kits have become more and more readily available. They get them through your malt suppliers, your BSG, your country malt, people like that. You can get them, and you can get them through the MBAA, can't you, John?
Yeah, I believe you can.
My other John. I've got lots of Johns. That's always one of my problems, is I have a lot of Johns.
You could just call me Dr. Hughes to distinguish if you want.
It works for me.
All right. Yeah. So Dr. Hughes, what would be some of the next steps somebody should take?
So next step, I think, is maybe now starting to get into some equipment, but it doesn't need to be. I mean, in my webinar, you're going to see I'm going to do like the sort of Yelp, $1 sign, $2 signs, $3 signs, kind of moving up.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can start out with just some really basic lab glassware and kind of test tubes and things like that. And if you don't have any kind of a situation where you can, you don't have running water in your lab or anything like that, you can get disposable pre-sterilized tubes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't advocate for that just from an environmental standpoint, but if that's sort of where you are right now and you're waiting to get a full lab set up, then that's a good place to start. And so you get these plastic tubes that are sterilized by gamma radiation, and you can just pop them open and collect your sample right away. If you do want to start going towards some reusable glassware and things like that, you are going to want to have a way of sterilizing your equipment. And so the standard in a laboratory is what's called an autoclave. And it's basically like a giant pressure cooker. So it brings your temperature up to 120 degrees Celsius, which is, I think, 251 Fahrenheit, and uses steam and pressure. So it's about 1 bar, I think 15 PSI or so of pressure. And you run that for 15, 20 minutes, depending on, if you've got large volumes of liquid, you can increase the time on that. But and that will sterilize your equipment beyond just the kind of boiling or heating up to 100 Celsius. And, an autoclave,
John,
sorry.
I was, excuse me, I was going to ask about the autoclave. You say a giant pressure cooker. Explain exactly how big a typical lab autoclave might be and what kind of money we're talking.
Yeah, so you can get, they come in all sizes. What you might see in a smaller lab in a brewery would be something that's maybe, I guess, a few gallons in volume. And you can get these, maybe about, say, a foot wide and maybe 2 feet deep, kind of a cylindrical shape. They're usually horizontally laid out. You can get these for a few $1,000s. You can find them kind of secondhand for maybe $500. But
eBay's your friend there.
eBay.
And you can get them, and they horizontally lay them out, because a lot of them are for surgical implements, dental tools, things like that, tattoo parlors. One of the things I did as a home brewer was I got a American canner. They make pressure cookers that are out of like a single piece of milled aluminum, and they make them huge, and they make them with electrical heating elements on the bottom, and they'll hold massive amounts of stuff. If you want to, and more brewery size stuff, if you've got like a large flask that you want to do, it'll hold multiples of those. So those are good. Those, but again, that can run up to 800, $1,000, and that's new. But yeah, you can get used stuff down, $200 or less. One of the things when you're talking about the plastic sampling, I used to make Chris Kennedy do when we first started was I got Whirlpack bags. You can get them really cheap, and it's essentially a sterile plastic bag that you can collect a sample in, and we'd collect wort off the heat exchanger, cold wort, and then you just whirl the bag to seal it, and then we'd just put it somewhere warm and see if it generated gas, whether there was, and that was one of our very first tests. That was one of our very simple tests that we did back when we were first starting out.
Yeah, and that's a really simple way. I mean, I know larger breweries that are, have a full lab that are still using Whirlpack bags, just because it's so easy to have that out in the brewery. You can just grab a bag, tear off the top and fill it. And just that forced wort test, just make sure you don't have any turbidity showing up, any CO2 being produced. Would be indication of some kind of wort contamination. And then if you really want to, you can crack that open later on and stick your nose in it and smell it. If you are worried about maybe some enteric bacteria or anything like that, you're going to get some of those volatile fatty acid, butyric acid flavors and aromas coming out of there. So I would say don't sniff too hard, don't taste it, because there are some potential pathogens that can survive in wort, but not in beer. So yeah, but real quick to go back to the autoclave, one little hack that I think is I've been telling everybody is there is a relatively new Instant Pot called the Instant Pot Max that actually will get up to a full 15 psi of pressure. And so I talk about this as using it as a pressure canner for some of your foods that are higher pH. But that is exactly what we want as an autoclave. And you can get this for about $150. It's not huge. You're not going to be able to fit a ton of glassware or anything in there. But if you're just doing a couple things here and there, you can just set it and go. And that's a really great way. It's self-contained. You plug it in and it's ready to go. So that's kind of one of the, yeah, that's one of the cheap tricks that I like to push a little bit.
There you go. Well, and it's so simple to use that it doesn't matter if you have to do multiple cycles or something. The cycles are pretty easy. That'll hold a fair amount, and then you don't have to really watch it that like some of the other ones, like the American canner, if it doesn't have the actual controlled heating element, you have to kind of watch the amount of heat you're putting in. But the Instant Pot's a great idea. And I bet you can get some used too.
Sure.
Come Christmas, get yourself that. If you're doing plates, all other stuff. All right. So let's say you're setting up a lab. What kind of tests should you be doing? I guess that's the hardest part for people. They
can
write stuff down. They can collect some information. They should be collecting temperatures, gravities, pH. They should be doing perhaps forced wort tests, forced ferment tests. Those are fairly easy to do. Once they are I think that transition into lab equipment and testing in the lab, that's where they start to kind of break down.
Yeah. So, and especially, if you're looking through some of this literature out there, you look at Mary Pelletier's book on quality assurance, and it can be really overwhelming. There's a lot of tests that you can do, and you don't need to do all of those. And I like to lay out sort of a priority list But yeah, I think forced wort test, making sure you're not getting contamination in your chilling. Forced fermentation you brought up, Jamil, is a great one and really easy to do. Doesn't even require you to sterilize any glassware or anything. But what this involves is you get a sample of your wort and then a sample of your yeast that you're going to pitch into that beer. And then you pitch yeast into there at about 10 times the rate that you would be pitching into a beer. And then you actually have a magnetic stir bar in there, and you get this on a stir plate, and you're basically, it's almost like you're making a starter here. But what your goal is to find out what your terminal gravity is going to be for that wort. And so if you have a beer that seems to get stuck somewhere in the fermentation, it doesn't get to what you have thought your terminal gravity should be, you can check against what your forced fermentation is. And then you can determine if that problem came from your yeast in fermentation or if it came from the hot side of things, if you messed up your temperature on the mash. Because if you mashed way too high, or you did something that kind of messed up some of your malt enzymes, you're going to not get that full attenuation. And that will show up in your first forced fermentation as well as in your tank.
Yeah, it'll tell you you've kind of, you may have hit terminal gravity and you may be wondering why it didn't finish out. And then it's like, no, okay, so we did hit terminal gravity. The problems elsewhere in our wort production, or we didn't even come close, and the problems in fermentation. So right there, you isolate your problem, or at least have an idea where. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more about building your QC program on the budget right after this. All right, we're back. We're talking with Dr. Jonathan Hughes from UC Davis. And he's the one who set up our quality assurance program here at Heretic Brewing. And he's got a webinar coming up on doing a QC program on a budget. What's the address for that people can sign up for?
That is cpe.ucdavis.edu /section/brewing-budget-quality-control. But if you just go to the cpe.ucdavis.edu, you should be able to find it.
There you go.
On there, and that's $75 for a 3-hour seminar. That will be June 3rd, Thursday, from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time.
Now, if people miss the webinar, can they get it, recording of it later on?
I know it will be recorded, and the recording will be available for a short time to the people who have enrolled. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that means you have to have watched it live to be able to access that, but you will have to enroll prior to the air date.
Okay, good to know. So yeah, make sure you sign up ahead of time. It's going to be worth it. I know Jonathan, and I know the information is going to be priceless. And for $75 towards quality in your brewery, you should spend it. Well, and you're also you're consulting for breweries now.
That's correct. Yeah, I've started a little business here. I'm sort of jokingly referring to myself as the beer doctor. I know that JP used to call himself that, but we'll have to fight over that title.
I think you were in that title more than he does. So, other than JP likes going to the doctor, yeah, that's as close as he gets to being a doctor.
So yeah, but you can email me at dr.beerphd@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer any questions you have. If you want to set up a consult, we will be able to get something going.
There you go. All right, check it out. So before the break, we had talked about doing forced ferment and things like that, and then, what's the next steps for somebody? What should they be doing in the lab?
I'd say next steps, probably checking for some common contamination. And that usually involves some kind of selective and differential media, growth media. So one of the big ones is looking for lactic acid bacteria. So lactobacillus and pediococcus. And fortunately, this guy named Hughes came up with a really good medium that will grow specifically lactobacillus and pediococcus. It'll also actually grow Brettanomyces. So that will help if you are looking for that contamination. And this is what's called a semi-solid agar. So it's agar is a kind of a gelling agent used to make microbiological media. And this is semi-solid, so it's kind of soft. And you actually get this in a state where it is still molten, but cool enough that it's not going to kill any of your organisms. And you just put 1 milliliter of beer into 9 milliliters of this HLP medium, as it's called. And then you sort of gently rock the tube back and forth. They refer to them as shake tubes, but you don't really want to shake too hard or else you get a lot of foam. So you just rock that back and forth, and then you let that grow for about 2 to 3 days at about 30 degrees Celsius. That is in American, actually, I don't really know what that temperature is. All the incubators usually set in Celsius.
Like that.
Yeah. And that actually brings up a really good point. Incubators are expensive and heavy and sometimes difficult to attain. Again, you can find them on eBay. You can find them on a lot of universities actually have surplus stores. So at UC Davis, it's called Aggie Surplus. It used to be called the Bargain Barn. And they will sell a lot of kind of used scientific equipment to the public for pretty cheap. That said, an incubator can still run you a lot of money. They can also still require a lot of energy to use, take up a lot of space. You know, I mean, space is at a premium in a brewery, especially if you've got a lab that's kind of in a closet somewhere. So a really good way of creating an incubator without having to use up all that space or spend all that money. And this is the first one that I had at the Heretic lab. Was I had a brew belt. That's a fermenter wrap with a little heating element that you can plug into a temperature controller if you're trying to ferment your home brew at colder than normal fermentation temperatures. So I had one of those, and I just put that inside of a styrofoam fishing cooler that you got for $1 at a gas station, and then plugged that into a Renko temperature controller set for 30 degrees Celsius. And that did the trick, you know. So that whole thing put together, I don't know how much a Renko temperature controller runs these days, but you know, if you are savvy enough, you can wire up an SDC 1000. Those run about, I think, $20-25, and so you can put this whole thing together for less than $50, and that works great. Mm-hmm. Also, if you are familiar with Terry Ferendorf. Mm-hmm. So Terry Ferendorf put together this primer. This is one of the things that I got that got me going in the lab, and she created the design for a similar kind of thing. She used just an incandescent light bulb as the heat source in a plastic like igloo cooler or something. So check that out. I think she was at Triple Rock Brewing, and she has this PDF freely available online. I can also maybe see if I can provide a link to that somewhere. But great resource. She talks a lot about HLP medium in detecting Pediococcus and Lactobacillus, as well as creating a sort of log system for tracking any contamination across different fermenters. So again, back to the writing things down. It can be really useful to write things down in a very useful way, you know, and instead of just having everything on successive pages of a notebook, you can create log sheets, keep them electronically online, and then searchable in that respect, and then being able to kind of reference back to them. So if you are getting contamination frequently, and it's always in the same fermenter, maybe you should start looking at some seals, looking at if there's any leaks or anything on that.
Right. For every batch. And one of my favorite cheap incubation areas is on the top of a refrigerator or to the side of the refrigerator where they blow the heat out the back of the refrigerator, to keep it cool. And either it tends to go up around the top of the refrigerator, or it tends to come out the side, depending on where the refrigerator is. And it tends to be a nice warmer area. It tends to be like 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding room. And that often is really close to a good incubation temperature as well. Yeah, I remember that styrofoam cooler incubator back in the day. That's a good way to start. So the HLP, going back to that, you can just buy this stuff pretty much done for you, right? Same with most of the plates. They come, you can buy pre-poured plates. You can buy tubes, all this stuff. What do you have to do with them to get them ready to go if you buy this stuff from somebody?
So yeah, if you buy the plates or tubes, you can basically just hit the ground running. With the tubes, you will need to boil them to sort of melt the agar that's in there. For some of the plates we'll talk about in a little bit, you want those to stay solid and everything, so they're just ready to use. But you can also, as a cheaper alternative, you can purchase this media as a powder that you can then hydrate, dissolve in water, boil that. So with the HLP medium, it's specifically designed to not need to be autoclaved. So it doesn't need to be sterilized in that autoclave. You can just boil it for 2 minutes and then cool it down. And the best way to do that is with a water bath. So you can dispense this into your tubes and then submerge those in a water bath that you set at 40 degrees Celsius, which is about 110, I think, Fahrenheit. And that will keep that agar molten, but bring the temperature down low enough that you're not going to worry about killing any of those organisms and getting a false negative.
Right.
So water baths, again, scientific equipment, can be really expensive and difficult to find, but a recirculating sous vide heater can do exactly that for you. And just have that in some sort of temperature incubated, a cooler or a pot or something, and you're good to go.
If you want to cook some chicken or a steak in your sous vide at the same time, you can. It's perfect. And you can get those sous vide recirculators on Amazon cheap.
Yeah, I think the cheapest ones are under $100, so not so bad.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's a good point. That's a good point as well. Yeah, I think, the people I've talked to that want to set up a lab, a lot of times they're just really nervous about, putting something in a tube or, plating something. And so, it's you can go ahead and start with, a pre-done media and tubes and just do that and then just try it. And then once you see the value of it, you can, buy your media, dry and prepare it and try that as your next step. It's not that difficult. It's pretty straightforward. If you can brew beer, I think you can do a lot of these lab things. And I know so many breweries that tell me, well, we taste our beer. We know that it's good. We know that there's no contamination. It's like, you have no clue. You really don't know. When we started out, we got pitches of yeast from some other breweries that I respect, and I think they make great beer, but they were fully contaminated. They had so much bacteria and wild yeast in them. It was just like, oh my God, this is a huge problem. That's why I decided to never take yeast from anybody, because I was just shocked. And these were people that, were producing a lot of beer. I appreciated that they're willing to loan me yeast, but um, it was a giant mistake. If somebody is not testing their beer for contamination, wild yeast, bacteria, it's in their beer. I guarantee you. I don't care how careful you are. Every once in a while, it can happen, and when it does, if you don't catch it, it then is in every beer you make. So all you people without a lab, you need to be doing some basics. Oh,
That's a great point, Jamil. You can have contamination without the sensory effects being evident. You know,
Mhm.
you can have some contaminating organisms growing at low enough levels that you're not detecting them, but they're still there and they're going to be spread through, just waiting for an opportunity to take hold. You know,
Mhm.
if that comes in where you pitched your yeast at a temperature that was a little too high for them, then some of those more thermotolerant microbes are going to be able to sort of take hold and really wreak havoc, excuse me. So yeah, testing is going to be able to allow you to identify that contamination really before it's a problem.
Mhm.
And
Now,
this is kind of where like Charlie Bamforth likes to run a or he likes to make a distinction between quality control and quality assurance. And quality control is very much retrospective. A problem has occurred. How do we resolve that? Whereas quality assurance is prospective. How do we prevent this problem from occurring and therefore not have to deal with it?
mhm, right. And so what would be your next step after doing these tests? So let's do this. Let's take another short break, and when we come back, I want to hear about exactly what would at what point do you need a microscope? We'll be back right after this. All right, we're back. We're speaking with Jonathan Hughes of UC Davis. He has a webinar coming up about quality programs on a budget. And I think that's perfect for every brewery out there, and especially the smaller breweries that are just starting out. They think that it's too much, that they need, giant labs and hoods and, laser beams and things like that, when all they really need is a few pieces of equipment that and the desire to provide quality. So everybody associates like a microscope with a lab. When do you need a microscope, John?
Yeah, great question. I would say as early as you can afford one. And what's nice is that there's some uh, perfectly decent microscopes out there for $75, new. Not to mention the ones that you can get for cheaper at a surplus store and things like that. And what's nice about the kind of microscope you need in a brewery is you don't need something really fancy. You don't need phase contrast. You don't need confocal or anything like that. A bright field microscope is really all you need. I mean, phase contrast is going to give you a little bit better distinction if you're looking at some smaller, and if you're really trying to do some cell morphology based identification, looking at the cell shapes and trying to go from there. But bright field is really what you need if you're going to just be interested in testing your yeast viability. And you also don't need crazy magnification. So most microscopes, you tend to have kind of 3 objective lenses on there that will go 40x, 400x, and 1000x magnification. Now the objective will be labeled 4x, 40x, and 100x because there's a 10x magnification on the ocular. But you don't even need that 100x objective for 1000x magnification to look at your yeast. They're large enough that 40x, or excuse me, 400x magnification will be fine.
Mhm.
And so if you're looking to do some counting on your yeast, you can get it yourself a hemocytometer. Used to be these things were $150, $200. but you can find them now on Amazon for I think $20 is the cheapest one. Now there's some pretty bad ones out there, so you got to be a little careful where the etching is not as good. But so this is like a special microscope slide that's got a grid etched into it, and it's got a special cover slip. So you put your yeast sample on there, you put that cover slip on the top, and then the space between the etching and the cover slip is referred to as the counting chamber, and it's got a defined volume. And so then you can count the number of yeast cells in that volume, and that gets you the number of cells per milliliter with a multiplication factor there. And so that way you can kind of pull a sample of your yeast slurry, figure out how much you have, and then figure out how much you're going to want to add into your beer based on your pitching rate and all of that. And then at the same time as this, you can do a quick viability stain with this stain called methylene blue. This stuff, you can get a bottle of this for, I don't know, $25 or something, and it's like a lifetime supply. It usually comes in a 1% solution, and you need a 0.01% solution for your yeast, and a very small amount of that. So you're diluting this quite a bit every time you do your yeast counting. And this will just stain them. It's a kind of dye that gets pulled into the yeast cell, and if the yeast is alive, it will reduce that dye. So it's a blue colored dye, and they will reduce it so that it looks clear. So when you're looking at this under a microscope, all the clear cells are alive or viable, and then all the blue cells will be considered non-viable.
John, I have one question regarding the microscope. I assume you're talking about light microscopes, optical microscopes. What about the USB, computer microscopes available these days? Do those work?
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. And those might even be better from a brewing standpoint because you can plug that directly into a computer, and it's a little easier to look at on a computer screen, and you can just save that file again and
right.
And as part of this sort of writing things down, so you can go back and say, hey, what was our cell count on that one? Like, I forgot to write it down, and you can go back and look at that image. So yeah, and you can get these, it comes in two ways. Some where the microscope doesn't even have an eyepiece. It's just got a kind of a CCD digital camera attached on the top of it. Some of them, it has it where you can just slide a USB connected camera over the top of your eyepiece. So you can kind of feel like a real scientist if you want and still look through the eyepiece, but when you want to plug it into your computer, you can get a nice image there.
Yeah, if you can get 400x magnification, you're all good to go.
That's kind of the gold standard then, 400x.
That's what you need for yeast work.
Okay.
Yeah, because when you get up to 1000x magnification, you actually need what's called immersion oil because of the light properties with these lenses. And I don't even know if you can fit, because a hemocytometer is a really, really thick microscope slide, and I think it might be too thick to fit underneath that objective lens. So I've never seen anyone use a hemocytometer with that 1000x magnification, just with the 400x.
Okay.
Yeah, when you're looking for bacteria and stuff like that, then you use the 1000 magnification. And
yeah, bacterial cells are much smaller, so it's much easier to look at the higher magnification level.
And if you're trying to look at for what are they, rods, cones, if you're trying to figure out what kind of bacteria you're dealing with, but there's other ways of doing that, right? There's media in the lab you can use to discern one or the other. Isn't that correct, John?
Absolutely. And in fact, microscopic identification is not really that useful when it comes to bacteria. I mean, yes, two kind of major bacterial cell shapes that you see are rods and spheres or cocci. But there are so many different possibilities within each of those. And yes, you can do some staining and things like that, but there's much easier, faster ways of doing identification. Special media that's selective or differential. So selective meaning it will only allow certain organisms to grow. Differential will allow many different ones, but will make different organisms appear differently on that. And then you can also do a number of really simple tests. So there's one that's a super simple test called the catalase test. And this is something that can be used to identify the acetic acid bacteria. So these are the ones that are aerobic, oxygen requiring contaminants of your beer. And so they have an enzyme called superoxide dismutase that you are looking for here that you contaminants of your beer. You are exposing them to hydrogen peroxide, and it's a very visible result. They'll create bubbles of oxygen gas if they are catalase positive. And so that can be something that's really quick. It would take 5 seconds to just scrape some of these bacteria onto a microscope slide and then squirt some hydrogen peroxide on there. And yeah, you can do a gram stain if you want. That's going to be a little more involved, requiring some different dyes and iodine and things like that. You can do a oxidase test. So this is going to require a special reagent, but easily attainable, but also will be something that is you get results in just a few seconds.
Rich was asking, he says there's lots of talk about stir plates beating up yeast. I don't think that's an issue. Is there such a thing as tilting, rocking a device to keep it moving, but more gently?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would second your thought. I don't know if stir plate is really going to do a lot of damage to the yeast cells, but you can get orbital shaker tables, you can get rocker tables, so all kinds of lab equipment that is useful for or that can be repurposed for kind of growing up yeast and things like that. So yeah, again, I would check with surplus stores at universities. You can check on eBay, Alibaba, whatever you want.
That's what I got a lot of our stuff on eBay, and for like $5, I would get like a shaker table, and it just the rubber belt inside. It's like a kind of like a drive belt, had broken, and that was all that was wrong with it. And for 50 cents, I bought a giant O-ring on McMaster car, and there you go. Problem solved. Still working today. So there's a lot of opportunity there.
Absolutely. And then, I think the home brewers listening will probably also be somewhat familiar with the computer fan stir plate. You can purchase a computer fan for pretty cheap, get some rare earth magnets,
Right.
Kind of glue them on there and then hook that up to a potentiometer. Put it in a cigar box.
You can get stir plates on eBay now because of the popularity of homebrewing, and they're $20 for a really nice stir plate. Or I just bought a really nice heated stir plate with RPM and temperature for, I think it was $50. I don't know. There's a bunch available. I'll tell you, they also have a lot of this gear up at Brew Chatter up in Sparks, Nevada, right next to Reno. Good folks there, RJ and Josh. Check them out, brewchatter.com. Great folks, and they've got a lot of the gear that you need to perfect your home brewing, and a lot of good information. Good folks, check them out. All right, let's take one more break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up talking about quality assurance in the brew after this. All right, we're back. I want to thank you, Jonathan, for being here with us and talking about lab stuff. There's so much to cover. I can see why your webinar is 3 hours, because there's a lot of questions people have and a lot of stuff people want to.
Absolutely, we've just barely scratched the
in an hour with breaks and everything. So if somebody's setting up a lab, uh, what else should they know? Or if somebody's just getting started,
Yeah.
what else should they know? What are
Which
the
tests are they focus on?
what do you think is the most important of the, beyond the super basics? What should they go for next?
I mean, I would say the next in line from all of this would be to consider getting what's called a spectrophotometer. And this is going to be a little bit, we're getting up into the $2 sign range here. But you can get these online new for $2,000 to $3,000. Now, if you want some of the higher end ones, they can get up to $10,000, but you don't necessarily need that. But this is the kind of instrument that's going to be able to actually give you an IBU measurement. It's going to give you a color measurement. You can even use it for clarity, as well as there's a colorimetric diacetyl test. So this is like, it's kind of an advanced piece of equipment, but because it's such a workhorse in the lab, I always recommend this is the kind of next step because it can be used for so many things. And there are, I'm sure, numerous other tests that are relevant in a brewing lab that can be done with this.
Our first one I got from Sierra Nevada. It was their first spectrophotometer. I still have it. And if there's a brewery out there that wants to carry this piece of history forward, I'd be willing to part with it now that we haven't used it in such a long time.
He'll also accept requests from a museum.
Yeah, from a museum as well. But I think that cost me like $150. I think the next one we got, I think you got at the surplus at UC Davis. But the thing to look for if you're getting one is that it's a UV spectrophotometer, because you'll need that range for the type of tests you do in a brewery.
That's right.
But you want the UV one capable of UV light. And the things that wear out on them is like the bulb, and that's pretty much it. If the thing powers up, it's good, and then you just need a bulb. All right, yeah, that's good. And then one more time, how do people reach you if they want to get some consulting advice on setting up a lab or anything brewing wise?
Yeah, you can email me at dr.beerphd@gmail.com.
There you go. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Again, everyone, he was the person that really set up our lab here at Heretic and helped us get started. And lab's a huge thing for us, and really is the reason why we can make great beer. In fact, I'll tell you, one of the things on pitching yeast, we always had the lab pitch the yeast for the brewery because it was such an important part of brewing, and we needed somebody in control of that really knew, cell counts and everything. I think that was a big part of our improvement program over the years. Today, I'm very proud to say, today we brew better beer than we did when we started, 10 years ago. It's vastly improved. And the beer back then, it wasn't bad, but I think it's much better today. And Jonathan, you're a big part of that, so I appreciate that. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to support our sponsors, Blickman Engineering, blickmanengineering.com. Send an email to feedback@blickmanengineering.com. Tell John Blickman how much you appreciate his support over the years. And then Brew Chatter, check them out. If you're ever up near Reno, stop by their shop. Great shop. You can get pints of beer while you check out all the goodies, and chat with two of the nicest guys in the homebrew world, RJ and Josh. Tell them I sent you. They'll be very happy to see you. Till then, everybody, brew strong.
Brew strong, everyone.